Yukio Mishima was a novelist, a playwright, an actor, and a patriot. 3 times nominated for the Nobel Prize, he was the most successful Japanese writer of his generation. 15 years ago, he killed himself samurai style by harakiri. November 25th, 1970. Mishima has come to army headquarters in Tokyo, and he's taken the commander hostage. He's demanding rebellion, a coup d'etat, to rid the country of its American-imposed constitution and restore the imperial system. Shouted down, he returns to the commander's office and disembowels himself with his samurai dagger. One of Mishima's companions has died with him. The other 3 are brought out under arrest.
There will never be a definitive account. It depends on one's angle. Some people see that it was intended to be a work of art. Others think it was fundamentally a political action. Others see elements of psychotic craziness. Others see his homosexuality somehow vindicated by what appears to have been a lover's suicide with Morita, the younger man who died with him. I personally feel the politics are absolutely crucial. I don't really see how one can regard the suicide of a man in the main military base in Tokyo as anything other than a political gesture.
A crowd of 10,000 attended Mishima's funeral. The people were stunned and confused by the death of their most popular author. By Japanese tradition, harakiri is an honorable way to die, if you're a samurai, but in theory at least, the days of the samurai are over. Some people were offended by Mishima's suicide, others saw it as inevitable.
すぐテレビをつけなさいって電話がかかってきて、ほんで舞台に出る寸前にね、舞台の事務所で、じゃあ電話を受けて、でそしてじゃあテレビつけてって舞台事務所のテレビをつけたら、彼がもう演説してる最中で、もう死んだ直後でしたね。でビデオテープを見たんです。でそれでその時におめでとうよかったなと思いましたね。ということは。彼が死に方っていうことはね、彼の念願だったわけですから。
ただしかしこういう結論は結局彼が自分のその文学的な生涯を美しく飾るためにやったことであって、ところがそのあんまり美しく飾りすぎるっていうことは必ずしも日本人の美学には合わないんで、僕なんかやっぱりもっと彼が年を取って醜くなって滅びていったんじゃないか、滅びていってもよかったんじゃないかと思う。そういう意味では大変彼が早く死んだことは残念だと思いました。
The warrior class of samurai lost their power and privilege a century ago when Japan opened up to the West, but they've not been forgotten. There are many Japanese today who share Mishima's respect for Bunburyodo, the way of the pen and the sword. The samurai manual Hagakure, used in the war to indoctrinate the kamikaze, was an inspiration for Mishima also, and his favorite reading. There is dignity in serenity, it says. There is dignity too in clenched teeth and flashing eyes. Mishima himself had samurai ancestry, and he was extremely proud of it.
You can easily find 2 contradictional characteristics of Japanese cultures or Japanese characters. One is elegance, one is brutality. But these 2 characteristics are very tightly combined sometimes, and our brutality, I think, comes from our emotion. It is never mechanized or systematized like Nazis' brutality. And I think the brutality might come from our feminine aspect, and elegance comes from our nervous side. Sometimes we are too sensitive about defilement or elegance or sense of beauty of such aesthetic side. And sometimes we are tired of it. And we need sometimes a sudden explosion to make us free from it. And for instance, after the war, our brutal side was completely hidden. But I believe it is just hidden, I think. And I don't like the Japanese culture is represented only by the flower arrangement or such a sort of peace-loving culture. We still have a very strong warrior's mind in
In Japan today, the values of the samurai appear to have been abandoned in favor of those of the salesman. With a booming economy, which is the envy of the West, the people have no wish to be dragged back to the days of feudalism. And yet, in the center of Tokyo, the emperor, who was worshipped as a god only 40 years ago, continues to live in his palace, and he remains a symbol of what it is that makes the Japanese feel Japanese. Mishima was more vocal than most in his support of the emperor system, but in one of his books he criticized the emperor himself, and many Japanese have never forgiven him for it.
After his death, because he was seen to have touched the ultimate taboo in Japanese society, which is the emperor, he himself became a taboo figure. So to this date, there has been no biography, there has been no review of his last important works, and people basically don't like talking about him at all.
It was a political embarrassment as well, because when just Japan was on the point of becoming member of the advanced industrialized nations whom we have copied so doggedly all those years. And then here comes this writer and killing himself as if the clock were put back 2 centuries. Certain people say the way he died, the way he worshipped the swords, the Japanese Hagakure cause of ethics of the samurais and everything, he is the most archaic, most reactionary Japanese. Now, in whatever little compartment as an individual, as a clown, which he liked to be, as an actor, as an imposter, as a gangster, as an aristocrat, in every little thing he tried to be, he over-existed. And I think that quality, the Japanese simply not only scorn, but find it intolerable, because we have all been brought up on this Confucius teaching. When there is a stink, put a lid on it.
What people regarded as a pose on my part was actually an expression of my need to assert my own true nature. And it was precisely what people regarded as my true self, which was a masquerade.
In his autobiographical novel, Confessions of a Mask, Mishima describes his early childhood. He was born Kimitaki Haraoka, the son of a civil servant. In the first weeks of his life, he was taken away from his mother, effectively kidnapped by his grandmother, a forceful personality descended from a high-class samurai family. He was forced to spend most of his childhood confined to his grandmother's sick room. He wasn't allowed to go out and mix with children of his own age. He consoled himself by reading his grandmother's books, and among them were the fairy tales of Oscar Wilde and Hans Christian Andersen.
From among Andersen's many fairy tales, only his rose elf threw deep shadows over my heart. Only that beautiful youth who, while kissing the rose given him as a token by his sweetheart, was stabbed to death and decapitated by a villain with a big knife. My heart's leaning toward death and night and blood would not be denied.
In later years, Mishima was educated at the Gakushuin, a famous school for children of the nobility. A dull student at first, he graduated top of his class and was presented with a gold watch by the emperor in person. At the outbreak of the Pacific War, Mishima was 16. In Confessions of a Mask, he describes his excitement at the idea of war and what he saw as the probability of dying a glorious death. He looked back on these years as the best of his life and constantly sought to recapture the spirit of the time. At his school, normal studies were abandoned in favor of the martial arts. Towards the end of the war, the students of Mishima's school were sent to work in a factory making aircraft for kamikaze.
This great factory worked on a mysterious system of production costs, taking no account of the economic dictum that capital investment should produce a return. It was dedicated to a monstrous nothingness. No wonder, then, that each morning the workers had to recite a mystic oath. I have never seen such a strange factory. In it, all the techniques of modern science and management, together with the exact and rational thinking of many superior brains, were dedicated to a single end: death.
And now, for the first time, the Navy releases actual films of these amazing kamikaze attacks. Films the world waited to see.
In 1945, the Japanese were faced with the first ever invasion of their country.
The air raids were becoming more frequent. I was uncommonly afraid of them, and yet at the same time I somehow looked forward to death impatiently with a sweet expectation. I thought that if by any chance I should attain glorious death in battle, how ill it would have become me, this would be a truly ironical end for my life, and I could laugh sarcastically at it forever from the grave. And when the siren sounded, that same me would dash for the air raid shelters faster than anyone.
Everyone who was 17 or 18 and happened to be male thought he was going to die in battle. That was just the universal assumption. Then he went to his army medical in the closing months of the war, and he faked a tubercular condition. He was rejected, and he never saw service in the imperial forces. And the common view is, I certainly share it, that he regretted that all his life. He had somehow missed his moment of glory.
What I wanted was to die among strangers, untroubled, beneath a cloudless sky. If such were the case, wasn't the army ideal for my purpose? Why had I looked so frank as I lied to the army doctor? Why had I said that I had been having a slight fever for over half a year, that my shoulder was painfully stiff, that I spit blood, and even last night I had been soaked by a night sweat? Why had I run so when I was through the barracks gate?
As the war ended, having missed his chance to die gloriously, Mishima withdrew in the face of the desolation around him. He made no attempt to help in the reconstruction of the country, but instead shut himself away with his books and devoted his efforts to his writing. In 1946, he received the sponsorship of the distinguished writer Kawabata, who was later to win the Nobel Prize. With Kawabata's help, his career took off. Confessions of a Mask was published when he was 24. It was an instant success and established Mishima as a literary star. A theme which recurs throughout Mishima's writing is an obsession with a mysterious and threatening notion of beauty. In one of his most acclaimed books, The Temple of the Golden Pavilion, the hero makes love to a girl for the first time, but in this, as in every other critical moment of his life, he is overwhelmed by a vision of the temple.
At first, it was as small as a miniature painting, but in an instant it grew larger, until it completely buried the world that surrounded me, and filled every nook and cranny of this world. Just as in that delicate model which I had once seen, the Golden Temple had been so huge that it had encompassed everything else. It filled the world like some tremendous music, and this music itself became sufficient to occupy the entire meaning of the world. The Golden Temple, which sometimes seemed to be so utterly indifferent to me, and to tower into the air outside myself, had now completely engulfed me, and had allowed me to be situated within its structure. The girl from the lodging house flew away into the distance like a tiny speck of dust.
Mishima was greatly influenced by European writers. His library was full of Western books, which he had carefully read and annotated.
He probably grew up, as many Japanese children do today, with as many Western books, even more Western books as part of their education than Japanese books. Treasure Island is as well known to a Japanese child as it is to any English child. Later on, as he grew up, he became interested in various English writers, but his first foreign language was German. And he was interested in Rilke, interested in various German novelists too. I think the most important influence of European literature on him, however, came from French literature.
He maintained that Nietzsche was a great influence, that Mann was a great influence, that Racine was a great influence. But ultimately, he was one of those Japanese writers who's very eclectic, who drew from his own tradition and from the Western tradition.
Mishima admired the West, and he craved recognition by the West. To achieve it, he had to have his books translated, and he cultivated friendships with foreign writers resident in Tokyo.
Mishima's sentences are full of complexities, involutions, and they are filled with unusual words, most unusual words. He knew the exact name for everything. And so I had to struggle, first of all, being sure of the words, secondly, with the complicated expression, and third, getting it to sound like English in the end. Sometimes it proved too much. Perhaps I could give you an example of it. This is not necessarily the best one, but it's from the play Madame de Sade. This is a speech given by the woman Saint-Fond, who is a very bad character. Immorality has always been for me a perfectly appointed, completely self-sufficient preserve. It has its shepherds' cottages and its windmills, its brooks and lakes. But besides such peaceful landscapes, it also has valleys belching forth sulphurous fire, wastelands, forests haunted by wild beasts, abandoned wells. Do I make myself clear? In the speech that I read by Madame de Saint-Fond, she speaks in very, very polite language. Even what she's describing is a nightmarish landscape. The difference in politeness, levels of politeness between one person and another can be approximated in English, but it will sound very affected if one tries it over too long a period of time. Many other problems involving the Japanese language itself are reflected in the translation. And Mishima was far more sensitive to Japanese than most authors who use the Japanese language as raw material for creating something. He delighted in the Japanese language. It offended him. It even gave him physical pain when somebody used language badly. So one had to be careful and respectful of his language, knowing that it was not simply effective Japanese, but very beautiful Japanese. He was very eager to be recognized. I think he would have done anything to get the Nobel Prize. It's a pity he didn't get it. At one occasion, I had agreed to translate a certain book of his, and when I showed signs of taking too much time over it, he asked if he might get somebody else to do it. And I said, of course. But it was most unusual. I think it was a general feeling of eagerness. Perhaps he already thought in terms of dying young or desirability of dying young. He wanted to be known in the world, recognized in the world as soon as possible.
October 1968. The prize has been won by Kawabata.
そういう意味でね、国際的に非常に僕はいいことだと思いますね。
Yukio desperately wanted the prize. He was in line to get it. But at a very late stage, his one-time mentor went to him, this is a very little-known story, and said, will you support me? And Yukio stepped down for the prize to be given to a much older man on the theory that in time, Yukio would get it.
僕のようなのが日本文学の代表だと思われるところは困るですね。
どうして困るんですか？全然困ることない。
それ困るな一番。
いやそれがですね。
With apparently no sense of the incongruous, the Japanese continue to imitate the West. And superficially, at least, the country looks increasingly Western. Mishima enjoyed the cultural borrowings as much as anyone. He lived in a Western-style house of his own design, drank sherry and smoked cigars. Yet for all the affluence of his lifestyle, he deplored Western materialism, which he saw as a threat to the Japanese sense of identity.
I think economical prosperity gives some bored feeling already. And it gave a big, huge spiritual vacuum and unbearable
boredom, particularly among intellectuals. But I think not only intellectual, but also among younger generations and half of populace, I think. And at the present situation, we are never satisfied, we are never contented. And we cannot believe such an economic prosperity. What it means. And we had, long tradition of samurai. They lived for the honor and the spirit, and they despised and looked down any money.
In retreat from the world of TV commercials, Mishima went as far as he could in the opposite direction, to the world of No, the oldest surviving form of Japanese theatre.
The No theatre is a temple of beauty. The pace above all wherein is realized the supreme union of religious solemnity and sensuous beauty. In no other theatrical tradition has such an exquisite refinement been achieved. True beauty is something that attacks, overpowers, robs, and finally destroys. One might liken this necrophilious aesthetic of the No to that of works by Edgar Allan Poe, such as Ligeia or Bernice. In No lies the only type of beauty that has the power to wrest my time away from the exterior Japan of today, and to impose on it another regime. And beneath its mask, that beauty must conceal death. For someday, just as surely, it will finally lead me away to destruction and to silence.
Inspired by the No theatre, Mishima wrote his own No plays. This is one of them. But he transferred the action from the 12th century to a modern setting.
I found out it is quite impossible to transfer the old stylized beauty of the No play, and I cut it off. I just picked up only the theme. For instance, in My Lady Aoi, the original No play takes place in some court life in the 12th century, and I moved it into the modern hospital in the 20th century.
As the hero visits his wife in the hospital, the spirit of a former lover returns to reclaim him and kill his wife.
Mishima 先生のね、ヒロインというのは、大変になんていうかしら、全てを持っているんですね。男らしい、男性的とも言えるんです。三島先生のヒロインをいただくと、まず生身の私自身を全部否定してかかって、新たにその人物、大変に巨大な人物を作り上げなければなりませんね。で、若い時私がそれに七点抜刀しておりました時に、先生がおっしゃってくださったこと、こんなことでした。秀子ね、人間っていうのは相反するものを持ってる。例えば優しさとそれから残酷さ、愛と憎しみというふうに、そういう一対になっているような2つの感情を片面だけじゃなくて両面を表すということをいつも意識していた方がその人物の深みが出る。で、その先生のヒロインはちゃんとそういうふうに描かれているんです。
Mishima's interest in the theatre began with the popular form, kabuki. As a child, he'd often been taken to kabuki by his grandmother. Now he began to work with kabuki actors, writing his own adaptations for their theatre.
Kabuki was developed among populace, and it was considered quite a baroque quite a bizarre place. And samurai was not permitted to go to Kabuki theater because it was considered quite a vulgar place. But in such a way, Kabuki developed itself in remarkable way. It has a lot of baroque characteristics, mixing up of tragic side and the humorous side.
The grand emotions of classical tragedy, emotions quite unrelated to our mundane lives, may seem to be guided, at least nominally, by historical facts. The world of disputed successions, campaigns of pacification, civil warfare and the like. But in reality, they belong to no period. They are the emotions appropriate to a stylized, grotesquely tragic world, luridly colored in the manner of a late woodblock print. Grief that goes beyond human bounds, superhuman passions, searing love, terrifying joy, the brief cries of people trapped by circumstances too tragic for human beings to endure.
At the beginning, Kabuki was acted by women. It's called a famous woman dancer called Izumo Okuni. But the Tokugawa government was very Confucianistic, and they prohibited the women on the theater because the actress was suspected as a sort of prostitute. And then Kabuki used the boys as a woman's part. But boys are also used as for the male prostitution. And the Tokugawa government prohibited it again. And then the Kabuki actors had to find their own way to act a female part, even by adult actors, which made a improvement in the technical acting of a female role. And it started around the 18th century, and through the 200 years, they developed a marvelous technique to express female part by man actors.
Mishima's interest in the onagata, the female impersonators, was more than platonic. He had love affairs with these actors and was fascinated by their sexual ambivalence. Not content with writing for the theatre, Mishima decided to try his hand at acting, and one day he joined his friend Akihiro Maruyama in a charity concert.
その時に私がねちょうど当日になって楽屋へ行ったらねもう三島由紀夫さんが来てるって言うんですね。どうしてこんなに早く、楽屋に入ってるのって言って部屋行ったんですよ。そしたらねソファーの上に大の字になって寝っ転がってで奥様が呆れてソファーへ立ってるんですね。そしてねおいタバコとかねおい靴を脱がせろとかえばってるんですよ。でどうなさったのって言ったらね奥さんがね見てくださいよってもう30分も前からこれやってるんですって。そしたら、ね、スターというのはなんと気分がいいもんだろうって彼はねスターの気分を味わいたくてしょうがなかったわけでスターぶってるわけそのくせね
Mishima went on to become a minor star of Japanese movies, playing gangsters and samurai assassins. And in one film, he was called upon to sing the theme song.
"きっとね彼があれでしょうねオセロを歌ったらねみんなカルメンの花の歌を歌ってるというふうに思うであろうというぐらいの大変な音痴だった。ところが1週間で治りましたよ音痴が。で注意力っていうのはもう大変なものでしてね。
Mishima was married with 2 children, a boy and a girl. He married at 33, mainly to please his parents by becoming more respectable. It was an arranged marriage, which was usual at that time, but Mishima's conditions were somewhat unusual. He stipulated that his bride must have no interest in his work and that she must be shorter than him. Mishima was 5 foot 1 inch. He had become Japan's best-selling author, and his success gave him the chance to travel, and to visit the exotic places that he had previously only read about. Enthusiastically, he toured the temples of India and Cambodia, but he was moved most of all by the physical beauty of Greek sculpture.
I know how to despise mere cool intelligence. What I want is intelligence matched by pure physical existence, like a statue, and for this I need the sun. I need to leave my dark cave-like study.
彼は私と知り合った頃はね、非常にアグリーな非常に痩せたままでしたけれどね、ある日ね、私新宿のクラブでね、ダンスしようってんで2人でダンスしたことあるんですよ。だからダンスしてる時にね、私は冗談でね、なんか「あなたどこ行ったの?」って言って、ね、みんなパッとだらけで「あなたいないわ」って言ったんですよ。そしたら彼もいつもね、非常にシニカル皮肉なね、バーナード・ショーみたいな面白い皮肉を言う人だったんでね、それで帰ってくると思ったのね。でそしたらものすぐ真っ青になって怒ってね、俺は不愉快だ帰るっつってさっと帰っちゃったの。で私その時に初めてね、彼の最大の言ってはならないところはここだったんだなって初めて分かったわけですね。でずっと後で彼はね、それからボディビル始めたわけで、そのボディビル始めた時にすでにね、死ぬ時に、つまり切腹をする時の肉体がね、非常に醜い肉体でね、切腹をするっていうことは非常に追いさらばれたね、しわばらをかき切るなんていうのはね、みっともないことだと思ってたのね。でその時のためにもう作らなきゃいけないって、もうその時にすでに始まってたわけ。
He said, I want to make a poem of my life. And he thought that meant in part making himself a beautiful body and then destroying it just before it began to come to pieces.
I cherished a romantic impulse toward death, yet at the same time I required a strictly classical body as its vehicle. If myself was my dwelling, then my body resembled an orchard that surrounded it. One day it occurred to me to set about cultivating my orchard for all I was worth. Little by little, the orchard began to bear fruit, and thoughts of the body came to occupy a large part of my consciousness.
As a child, Mishima had watched enviously from a distance as portable shrines were carried through the streets in Shinto festivals. Now, at last, he felt strong enough to join in.
The intuition of my infancy, the intuitive sense that the group represented the principle of the flesh, was correct. The group was concerned with all those things that could never emerge from words: sweat and tears and cries of joy or pain. If one probed deeper still, it was concerned with the blood that words could never cause to flow. For though verbal expression may convey pleasure or grief, it cannot convey shared pain. Though pleasure may be readily fired by ideas, only bodies placed under the same circumstances can experience a common suffering. Only through the group, I realized, through sharing the suffering of the group, could the body reach that height of existence that the individual alone could never attain. And for the body to reach that level, at which the divine might be glimpsed, a dissolution of the individuality was necessary.
Ironically, far from merging with the masses or behaving with typical Japanese modesty and self-effacement, Mishima was becoming more of an exhibitionist than ever before.
When at last I came to own such a body, I wanted to display it to everyone, to show it off and let it move in front of every eye, just like a child with a new toy. My body became for me like a fashionable sports car for its proud owner. In it I drove on many highways to new places. Views I had never seen before opened up for me and enriched my experience. But the body is doomed to decay, just like the complicated motor of a car. I, for one, will not accept such a doom. This means that I do not accept the course of nature. I know I am going against nature. I know I have forced my body onto the most destructive path of all.
He hated the puny boy, the pretty puny boy, and he wanted to be a rough macho type. He wanted to be all muscles. He wanted to be all body. As it was, he was scarcely, as he began, he was scarcely body at all and all intellect. He wanted to make himself the opposite. Surely that is self-loathing. And with the self-loathing is a very strong strain of, and here too the two are mixed in together. I was going to say masochism. Masochism runs all through Mishima's writing, but masochism and sadism so often go together, and surely they did in Mishima. In the first of his really important novels, the Confessions of a Mask, there's the very famous scene in which the narrator, the boy who is the central character, has, I believe it's quite explicitly stated, his first orgasm as he's viewing a picture of Saint Sebastian. Is it because he associates himself with Saint Sebastian, or is it because he associates himself with the people who shot the arrows? It's probably both.
He dreamt of bloodshed. He dreamt of massacring youths, preferably Circassian, i.e. white youths on large marble tables, and eating parts of their bodies. And these obsessions go all the way through his life. I remember once kneeling in front of him while he demonstrated, for the benefit of a visiting television journalist, how you cut off someone's head in a classical harakiri. I suddenly had a terrible tingling at the back of my neck, regretted what I was doing. You could feel the force of his imagination. There's a very nasty side to his character. I think of him as part gentleman and part gangster.
The weapon of my imagination slaughtered many a Grecian soldier, many white slaves of Arabia, princes of savage tribes, hotel elevator boys, waiters, young toughs, army officers, circus roustabouts. I would kiss the lips of those who had fallen to the ground and were still moving spasmodically.
Typically, Mishima set out to surprise and shock his audience. And now, with the unwitting assistance of the photographer Shinoyama, he began to anticipate his own death in pictures.
相当三島さんに僕はうまく使われたって感じがしますね。だから非常に三島さんのうまくパブリシティをしていると。だから非常に三島さんは写真家っていうのをうまくコントロールしてですね。三島さんのよく裸になってるんですけども、裸でも全身の写真っていうのは意外とないんですね。それはどうしてかというとね、下半身っていうのは非常に鍛えてもですね、鍛えにくいんですよね。上半身は鍛えやすいんですけど。ですから下半身は割に貧弱になるので、それを撮るときにはですね、このオートバイの写真なんかありますけども、アングルを下から持ってってですね、でこの足を割と太く持って力強く撮るというようなね、そんなこともですね、かなり僕に対してね、要求してきたということもありましたね。それからここはこれは非常に有名な写真なんですけど、セバスチャンの死と、これは歴史ですけども、男の死に様というものをテーマに、彼が演じると、そういうふうなことで、撮ったわけで、撮る前はもう非常に綿密な打ち合わせをしまして、でコンセプトを考えて、それで撮ったわけです。
As Mishima was later to say, the river of the body flowed naturally into the river of action. Trading on his reputation as a writer, he was allowed to train with the self-defense forces, and increasingly he devoted his time to the martial arts.
I particularly liked kendo from the sense of beauty, but gradually I found out the traditional value of the kendo, and it used to be close to the duel, death fighting, and old kendo player wanted to get real experience of the border of death and life, you know. And in the samurai tradition, the sense of beauty was always connected with death. And for instance, if you commit harakiri, the samurai was requested to make up his face by powder or lipsticks in order to keep his face beautiful after his such a suffering death.
"1960, and violence erupts on the streets of Tokyo as students demonstrate against the security treaty with the United States. For Mishima, it marks a turning point in his political thinking.
The events of that year, and he went out the streets and saw the riots and saw a lot of violence, triggered in his mind a sort of explosion of patriotic vigor, and he wrote a short story called Patriotism, where for the first time he described in great detail what a harakiri is actually like. There you can see him, in a sense, rehearsing his own death for the first time in that horrible short story.
In 1965, Mishima turned his story into a film, and in Japan it was a huge success. Mishima wrote it, directed it, and starred in it as a young lieutenant caught up in the attempted coup of 1936. In a conflict of loyalties, he commits harakiri to the strains of Wagner.
Spiritually, I wanted to revive some samurai spirit through it, because I don't want to revive harakiri itself, but through the vision of such a very strong vision of harakiri, I wanted to inspire and stimulate younger people. And through such a stimulation, I wanted to revive some old traditional sense of honor or sense of very strong responsibility and such a sense of death in honor. That's my purpose. Such a way of very extreme eroticism and such a bloody eroticism is, maybe it was born in my mind from my birth. And on the other hand, I don't want to show it as a private confession or something like that. I want to combine it with the most public situation.
The public situation Mishima refers to relates to the status of the emperor in the post-war period. Mishima was an avowed imperialist, but he was critical of Hirohito.
In early 1946, the emperor announced under pressure from the Americans that he had never been a deity, was not a deity, never would be a deity. And so, from Mishima's point of view, millions of Japanese soldiers had died in vain.
In his short poem, Voices of the Heroic Dead, which he reads here, Mishima's criticism is expressed by a chorus of the souls of dead kamikaze.
激しき者大しき魂は血を払う。血をはことごとく汚れて平和によどみ、ほとばしる清き血潮は枯れ果てぬ。天がける者は翼を折られ、不朽の栄光をばシロアリどもは嘲笑う。かかる日になどてスメロには人となりたまいしなどてスメロには人となりたまいしなどてスメロには人となりたまいしなどてスメロには人となりたまいしなどてスメロには人となりたまいし
The riots continued throughout the 60s, culminating in the siege of Tokyo University, when 200 students held off the police for 2 days with petrol bombs. The security treaty was due for renewal in 1970 and was expected to provoke a fresh outbreak of student violence. Mishima's patriotism took a new turn. He decided to form his own private army with students of the right. Mishima's army had 80 members. At first it was called the National Defense Army, but he changed the name to Tatenokai, the Shield Society. Its avowed purpose was to oppose communism, maintain the national spirit, and defend the emperor.
I particularly picked up the student from the university where the conflict or trouble happened. And such a minority of students who cannot be involved into the leftist movement felt very isolated and very separated. And so they believed in some sense, they believed their own Japan and Japanese spirit, but, you know, it was completely denied by the leftist student movement.
Most people made fun of Mishima's private army, but those at the top believed that such a right-wing militia might contain the seeds of something useful. Mishima was invited to train his small company with the Japanese army at Mount Fuji.
No street demonstrations for us, no placards, no Molotov cocktails, no lectures, no stone throwing. Until the last desperate moment, we shall refuse to commit ourselves to action, for we are the world's least armed, most spiritual army. Some people mockingly refer to us as toy soldiers. Let us see.
He went to Nakasone, who was then out of office and who was to become defense minister in 1970. And he went to Sato, who was then prime minister and was prime minister from 64 to 72, and he got their support. From Nakasone, he got the introductions to the senior officers of the armed forces, and from Sato, incredibly enough, he got money. That money started from a businessman on the right, and it came through in early 1970, almost a year before Yukio died. I think the politicians did have a tremendous influence on him in shaping his notion of what he was doing. They thought that Yukio's ideals were ideals that were vital for the future of their nation. They wanted to see the military legalized, which they are not under the present constitution. And they had many other aims subsidiary to that, all of which, in effect, Yukio supported. He wanted to see a nuclear-armed Japan. Nakasone did not go as far as that. And towards the end of Yukio's life, there was a great breach between him and Nakasone, because Nakasone absolutely refused to consider the idea of going straight for nuclear weapons, which was what Yukio wanted to do. If this episode is hammered home by the Japanese press, Mr. Nakasone will lose his position as Prime Minister of Japan tomorrow.
Mr. Nakasone is already at the heart of a storm of criticism, because he made an official visit this year to Tokyo's Yasukuni Shrine, traditionally the heart of militant nationalism and emperor worship. He's the first prime minister to have done so since Japan's defeat. Japan's wartime leader, General Tojo, was executed in 1947 as a war criminal. But in a ceremony held here recently, Tojo's spirit was admitted to the realms of the gods. He joins the heavenly ranks of 13 other wartime leaders whose spirits are worshipped in the shrine. In the eyes of many, Mr. Nakasone's visit is a public and official declaration that the wartime activities of the Imperial Army have at last gained respectability in modern Japan. By slow degrees, Mr. Nakasone is shifting his government's policies towards the right, whilst in the meantime, Mishima has been publicly adopted by those of the extreme right, many of whom believe that his spirit continues to guide their actions.
One cannot help but be concerned by the fact that he is, I think, creeping forward as some kind of a hero. It's a slow process, but that seems to be happening. And at the same time, the Japanese are gradually rearming. Was this not what he was calling for in his last speech? That was certainly the gist, the pith of his last speech. He was calling for rearmament. That was what he was doing for the last 10 years of his life, nuclear rearmament. And the thought of such a nuclear rearmed Japan, to me, is absolutely terrifying. I'm not necessarily totally pessimistic. I think the situation can be turned around. But insofar as people follow the ideals of my friend Yukio, they're headed for world nuclear disaster.
In 1970, the riots Mishima had expected failed to materialize. The emperor had no need of an extra bodyguard, and the Tatenokai no longer had a function. Mishima decided on a new role for them. They would be a suicide squad to help him in the death he had planned so long. He would stage a coup, but there was no chance it would succeed. Its real purpose was to provide him with a platform for one last grand gesture. And to make sure it wouldn't go unnoticed, on the morning of November the 25th, he invited the media to join him at army headquarters. That morning, Mishima's wife had taken the children to school as usual. She was unaware of the meticulous arrangements her husband had made for his final hours. If she had looked at his diary, she would have seen that all future engagements had been cancelled. On his desk lay the final page of his last book, dated as if he'd finished it that very morning, and a note which said, "Human life is limited, but I would like to live forever."
The river of body naturally flowed into the river of action. It was inevitable. With a woman's body, this would not have happened. A man's body, with its inherent nature and function, forces him toward the river of action, the most dangerous river in the jungle. Alligators and piranhas abound in its waters. Poisoned arrows dart from the enemy camps. This river confronts the river of writing. I've often heard the glib motto, "The pen and the sword join in a single path." But in truth, they can join only at the moment of death.
The harakiri is a very positive, very proud way of death. I think it is very different from the Western concept of suicide. Western concept of suicide is always defeat itself, mostly. But harakiri sometimes makes you win.